The conference room fell silent the moment the receptionist opened the door. "There you are," she said, looking directly at me. "The candidate has arrived." I stood up from my chair, straightened the sleeves of my navy blue jacket, and picked up the leather folder containing the interview documents. The executive sitting beside me glanced toward the hallway, expecting another ordinary applicant to walk through the door. Instead, I looked through the glass panel and froze. Standing outside with a neatly pressed grey suit, a worn leather briefcase, and noticeably tired eyes was my Uncle Richard. He had more grey hair than I remembered. The expensive watches he used to collect were gone. The confident smile that once filled every family gathering had disappeared. He looked nervous. Very nervous. He hadn't noticed me yet. The receptionist smiled politely. "Mr. Carter, shall I send him in?" I nodded once. "Yes." The door opened. My uncle stepped inside, holding his resume with both hands. He looked at the executives first. Then his eyes met mine. Everything stopped. His face drained of color. "Oh, Ethan." His voice barely came out. I simply looked back at him. Neither angry nor triumphant. Just calm. For nearly 20 years, every family gathering had included at least one joke about my old car, my ordinary salary, and what he proudly called my small ambitions. Now he stood before me asking for a job. But this story does not start here. Welcome back to Revenge Cold Stories. Before we go any further, drop your first name and your city in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and become part of this growing community where quiet patience always has the final word. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 42 years old. Most people who meet me today assume I've always been confident. They see the executive office, the tailored suits, the leadership position, the company worth several $billion that trusts me to build entire divisions from the ground up. They see the results. They don't see the years that came before. I grew up in a modest neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio. My father repaired industrial machinery. My mother worked 32 hours each week at the local library before taking evening bookkeeping jobs for small businesses. Money wasn't something we talked about dramatically. It simply wasn't there. When I was 12 years old, Dad taped a handwritten piece of paper above the kitchen table. It wasn't a motivational quote. It wasn't even particularly inspiring. It simply read, "Spend less than you earn." That piece of paper stayed there for 13 years. Every morning we saw it while eating breakfast. Every evening we saw it while finishing homework. Looking back now, I realize my parents weren't teaching us how to become rich. They were teaching us how to become stable. There's a difference. Stability doesn't make exciting headlines. But stability keeps food on the table. It keeps promises. It keeps families together. Uncle Richard believed stability was another word for failure. He was my father's older brother by 7 years. Even as teenagers, they couldn't have been more different. My father fixed broken bicycles for neighborhood kids. Richard sold those same bicycles after repainting them. Dad enjoyed understanding how things worked. Richard enjoyed convincing people they needed something new. Neither approach was wrong. They were simply different. Richard had charisma. The kind that made complete strangers feel like lifelong friends within 5 minutes. He could walk into a room full of investors and somehow become the center of every conversation. Dad admired machines. Richard admired opportunities. By the time I was born, Richard owned a growing commercial real estate company. He drove imported luxury cars. He belonged to private golf clubs. He wore custom-made suits long before anyone in our family even understood what custom tailoring meant. Family dinners slowly transformed into stages. Richard never announced he was successful. He performed success. The keys landed loudly on the table. The designer sunglasses remained indoors. Every phone call somehow involved another investment. Another building. Another acquisition. Another deal. As children, my cousins loved it. Adults admired it. Even I admired it. Until I became old enough to understand the difference between confidence and comparison. I was 8 years old during the first memory that still follows me today. Grandma invited everyone for Thanksgiving. Dad arrived driving our 14-year-old station wagon. One of the doors only opened from the inside. The heater worked whenever it wanted. Richard arrived 20 minutes later in a brand new European luxury sedan. Everyone walked outside to admire it. The metallic paint reflected the afternoon sun. I remember touching the smooth surface with one finger. "It feels different," I whispered. Richard laughed. "It costs different too." Everyone chuckled politely. Then he looked toward Dad. "Maybe one day." Dad smiled. "Maybe." No argument. No embarrassment. Just one word. "Maybe." When dinner began, Richard continued describing the car's engine, imported leather, and handcrafted interior. Someone asked my father about work. Dad happily explained how he'd repaired an agging factory machine that saved his employer nearly $80,000 in replacement costs. Richard interrupted. "And how much bonus did they give you?" Dad smiled. "They thanked me." Richard laughed. "I would have negotiated equity." The adults laughed again. Dad returned to eating. I didn't fully understand the conversation. But I understood something else. Dad had been proud before that interruption. Afterward, he became quiet. Children notice those moments. We always do. That memory became strangely familiar over the years. Every achievement from my parents somehow became smaller whenever Richard entered the room. If Dad repaired equipment, Richard bought another building. If Mom completed accounting courses, Richard announced another investment. It wasn't that Richard openly hated us. He genuinely believed success should be measured publicly. If nobody knew about your accomplishment, did it even matter? That philosophy shaped his entire personality. And eventually, it shaped mine too. Just not in the way he expected. By high school, I loved mathematics. Not because I dreamed about becoming wealthy. Because numbers didn't lie. Equations didn't care who drove expensive cars. They only cared whether the answer was correct. At 16, I started working weekends at a neighborhood hardware store. $8.75 per hour. Every paycheck followed the same pattern. 30% into savings. 30% toward college. The rest helped my parents with groceries and gas. Friends spent summers buying sneakers. I bought textbooks before classes started because used copies became cheaper during August. Richard found this amusing. "You save too much." He said it almost every Christmas. "You only get one life." Dad would quietly answer. "Exactly." Neither ever convinced the other. By graduation, I had saved almost $14,000. Not through brilliance. Not through luck. Through consistency. That became the invisible habit nobody noticed. My cousins thought I was boring. They spent weekends chasing excitement. I learned spreadsheet software. They laughed. I learned basic accounting. They laughed harder. One cousin asked if I planned to marry a calculator. Even I laughed at that one. Life should include humor. But humor reveals beliefs. Looking back now, they weren't laughing at spreadsheets. They were laughing at ordinary discipline. After college, I earned a position as a financial analyst with an insurance company. Starting salary, $46,000. Nothing extraordinary. Just honest work. The office wasn't glamorous. Grey carpet. Fluorescent lighting. Coffee that tasted slightly burnt every morning. I loved it. Every report taught me something. Every project improved another skill. Promotion wasn't my obsession. Learning was. The first car I ever bought with my own money was already 11 years old. Silver, 183,000 miles. A few scratches. A small crack across one taillight. Mechanically perfect. People apologized when they saw it. You deserve something newer. I smiled. This one starts every morning. That was enough. For me. Not for Uncle Richard. The next family barbecue changed everything. I pulled into my grandmother's driveway after finishing work. My old sedan made its usual clicking sound after the engine stopped. I grabbed a bowl of homemade potato salad from the passenger seat and walked toward the backyard. Richard noticed the car immediately. "Ethan," he waved loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Is that thing still alive?" Laughter. I smiled. "So far." He walked closer. Circled the car dramatically. "I've seen museum pieces newer than this." Maury laughed. Someone joked that antique collectors might make an offer. Richard looked around proudly. "What exactly does your company pay you?" I answered honestly. "Enough." He grinned. "No, seriously. Enough to pay my bills." He shook his head. "You've got to dream bigger." "I do." "Then where's the evidence?" He pointed directly at my car. "This." I looked at the vehicle. "It gets me to work. It gets you nowhere impressive." The sentence landed harder than he intended. Not because it hurt my pride. Because everyone stayed silent afterward. Dad changed the subject. Mom asked whether anyone wanted lemonade. Conversation recovered. But something inside me quietly settled. I stopped hoping Uncle Richard would someday understand me. Instead, I decided I didn't need him to. That realization brought surprising peace. From then on, every gathering followed nearly the same script. Someone mentioned work. Richard discussed profits. Someone complimented his newest vehicle. He accepted the praise naturally. Then, eventually, he found a way to mention my old car. Or my ordinary office. Or my predictable life. Never with outright cruelty. Always disguised as humor. The strange thing was that I don't think he believed he was hurting me. He believed he was motivating me. In his mind, embarrassment created ambition. In mine, it created distance. I attended fewer dinners. Stayed shorter at holidays. Spent more weekends helping my parents around the house, instead of attending expensive family outings organized by Richard. Years passed. Quietly. Steadily. While everyone watched Richard's visible success. Almost nobody noticed the invisible foundation I was building beneath my own life. And that invisible foundation would eventually become stronger than anyone at those family gatherings could possibly imagine. To be continued. I noticed something important. Your master prompt specifically says SIOF final script output Caro, Koi heading label. In my previous reply, the story was mistakenly placed inside a writing block, which doesn't match the format you want. I'll continue with only the story itself from this point onward. The years that followed didn't arrive with dramatic turning points. They arrived the way most important years do. Quietly. One Monday became another. Quarterly reports turned into annual reviews. Projects became responsibilities. Responsibilities became leadership opportunities. At 26, I was promoted to senior financial analyst after leading a cost reduction project that saved the company just over $3.4 million across 18 months. There was no celebration beyond a brief meeting, a handshake from my director, and an increase in salary that felt almost unreal compared to where I had started. When I called my parents that evening, my mother cried. Dad asked only one question. "Do you still like the work?" I do. Good, that's worth more than the promotion. He meant it. That was always his measure of success. Not titles, not office size, not salary. Whether you could wake up on Monday without dreading your own life. I drove the same silver sedan to work the next morning. 209,000 miles. Still dependable. Still marked. Still mine. The next family gathering happened during Grandma Helen's 78th birthday dinner. Richard had recently purchased another luxury SUV. It cost more than my annual salary at the time. The entire family gathered outside to admire it before dinner. Someone asked about the engine. Someone else complimented the leather seats. Richard accepted every compliment as naturally as breathing. Then he spotted me parking at the end of the driveway. There he is. He laughed loudly. The last loyal customer of that old sedan. Several relatives turned toward my car. One cousin smiled awkwardly. Another looked away. Grandma quietly walked over and hugged me before anyone else could say another word. She had always understood more than she admitted. Richard walked toward me with his usual grin. So tell me, Ethan, when are you finally going to buy yourself a real car? I smiled. This one still works. It barely works. It got me here. He laughed. You always settle. I looked at him calmly. I don't think I do. You've worked the same kind of job for years. Yes. You've driven the same car forever. Yes. You've never started a business. No. So where's the ambition? I thought about answering. Instead, I simply shrugged. I'm happy. For a second, Richard looked almost confused. It was as though happiness without expensive proof didn't make sense to him. He chuckled. Small goals. I carried Grandma's birthday gift inside without responding. Later that evening, she found me helping wash dishes. You know, she said quietly while drying a plate, your uncle has always confused being admired with being loved. I looked at her. She continued stacking dishes carefully. They're not the same thing. Those words stayed with me far longer than Richard's jokes ever did. My career continued moving forward in ways that rarely attracted attention. At 29, I managed a department of 12 analysts. At 31, I supervised 43 employees across 3 regional offices. By 34, I had completed executive leadership training, funded entirely by the company. The training lasted 14 months. Every second Friday, I flew to Chicago for workshops. Most weekends were spent studying. No glamorous social media posts. No champagne celebrations. Just notebooks filled with ideas about leadership, organizational behavior, negotiation, and long-term planning. One instructor said something that permanently changed how I viewed management. Your job isn't to be the smartest person in the room. It's to build a room full of smart people. I wrote that sentence down immediately. Years later, I still keep it inside my desk drawer. Around the same time, Richard's company seemed unstoppable. He appeared in local business magazines. He sponsored charity galas. He donated to universities. He expanded into neighboring states. Whenever relatives talked about success, his name came first. No one could deny what he had accomplished. He had created jobs, developed properties, generated millions in revenue. He deserved recognition. The only problem was that success slowly became his identity, instead of simply something he had achieved. If one investment succeeded, he invested larger. If profits increased, he borrowed more. Growth became expectation. Expectation became pressure. Pressure became risk. None of us noticed it then. Not even him. At Christmas one year, he stood beside the fireplace holding a glass of sparkling water while explaining his newest commercial development. We're financing almost everything. One cousin looked impressed. Isn't that risky? Richard smiled confidently. Debt is just a tool. Dad quietly stirred sugar into his coffee. A tool can still hurt the person using it. Richard laughed. That's why you never became rich. Dad smiled politely. And maybe that's why I sleep well. The room became strangely quiet. Richard changed the subject. But I noticed something. For the first time in my life. His smile looked rehearsed. Not fake. Just tired. As though maintaining the image required more energy than before. I didn't think much about it then. I wish I had. Because beneath all the confidence, tiny cracks had already begun to appear. The first sign wasn't dramatic. There were no newspaper headlines. No television interviews. No public scandals. It was a conversation I almost missed. At my cousin Melissa's wedding, Richard stepped away from the reception twice to answer phone calls. That wasn't unusual. He had always taken business calls, even during holidays. What was unusual was the expression on his face when he returned. His smile appeared a fraction of a second too late. He laughed just a little louder than everyone else. He ordered another cup of coffee instead of joining the dance floor. Most people didn't notice. Years of studying financial statements had taught me that problems rarely appear all at once. First, there are tiny inconsistencies. Then patterns. Only later do they become obvious. That evening, while everyone else celebrated, I found myself standing beside Dad near the patio. He watched Richard across the room for several seconds. "What are you thinking?" I asked. Dad kept his eyes on his older brother. "He's carrying something heavy." "You think business, I don't know." "What makes you say that?" Dad smiled sadly. "I've known him for almost 50 years. When Richard is truly relaxed, he tells stories. When he's worried, he talks about money." I looked back toward my uncle. For nearly 20 minutes, every conversation he had somehow returned to investments. Interest rates, construction costs, financing, expansion. Dad was right. I had simply never noticed before. 3 months later, I accepted the biggest opportunity of my career. A multinational logistics company offered me the position of Director of Financial Strategy. The role required relocating nearly 300 miles away. The salary nearly doubled. The responsibility was unlike anything I had managed before. I spent an entire weekend thinking about it. Not because I doubted myself. Because accepting meant leaving my parents behind. Dad settled the question during Sunday breakfast. "You've spent your whole life preparing for opportunities." He buttered another piece of toast before continuing. "Don't become afraid of the very thing you've worked toward." Mom nodded. "We'll miss you. But we'll be proud every day." 2 months later, I packed everything I owned into a rented moving truck, including the old silver sedan. It now had over 240,000 miles. Everyone at work assumed I would replace it after receiving my new salary. Instead, I drove it another 3 years. Not because I couldn't afford something newer. Because I didn't need something newer. That confused people. It also saved me more money than anyone realized. While coworkers upgraded lifestyles after every raise, I quietly invested almost 40% of my income. Index funds, retirement accounts, emergency reserves. Nothing exciting. Everything consistent. The interesting thing about consistency is that it looks unimpressive. Until enough years pass. The new company challenged me every single day. Instead of analyzing departments, I now helped shape. The next 6 months passed without a single family gathering. For as long as I could remember, there had always been a birthday, an anniversary, a holiday dinner, or a barbecue bringing everyone together. Now there was nothing. Not because anyone was angry. Because everyone understood that Richard needed time. Losing a business isn't like losing a single possession. It's losing routines, employees, daily purpose, the identity you've repeated to yourself every morning for years. People often say money can't buy happiness. Maybe that's true. But losing everything can certainly test it. I heard small updates through my parents. Richard and my aunt had sold their house. Not because they wanted to. Because they had to. The 5-bedroom home where every Christmas party had been hosted was replaced by a modest 2-bedroom townhouse on the other side of the city. His luxury vehicles disappeared one by one. The golf club membership ended. Several investment properties were liquidated. One afternoon my mother quietly said something that stayed with me. "You know what your uncle misses the most?" "What?" "People calling." I looked at her. She folded another towel before continuing. "When someone is successful, the phone never stops ringing. When they aren't." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. One Saturday afternoon I decided to visit. Not because anyone asked me to. Because it felt right. I bought coffee from a small local cafe Richard used to recommend years earlier, back when he insisted they served the best espresso in the county. Funny how memories work. Sometimes the smallest details survive the longest. The townhouse was clean. Simple. Quiet. Richard answered the door himself. For just a second, surprise crossed his face. "Ethan." "Hi." I was nearby. That wasn't entirely true. I had driven nearly 45 minutes. "I brought coffee." He looked at the paper cups for a moment before stepping aside. "Come in." The living room contained only what was necessary. A sofa, a bookshelf, 2 lamps, no expensive artwork, no oversized television, no signs of the lifestyle he once displayed so proudly. We sat without speaking for almost a minute. Finally he smiled faintly. I used to think silence meant failure. And now I think silence just means people have stopped pretending. I nodded slowly. That sounded like a different man. Not a broken one. Just an honest one. He looked toward the window. "You know, I owe you an apology." "You don't have to." "I do." He took a deep breath. "I made fun of your car for years." I smiled. It was a pretty old car. He laughed for the first time. "A very old car." We both laughed. Then his expression became serious again. "It wasn't really about the car." "I know. I kept comparing everyone because..." He searched for the words. "Because if I wasn't the most successful person in the room, I didn't know who I was." Those words carried no self-pity. Only realization. I had waited almost 20 years to understand why he behaved the way he did. The answer turned out to be much sadder than I expected. Confidence had never been the reason. Insecurity had. Just hidden behind expensive things. We talked for nearly 2 hours. About business, leadership, mistakes, family. He admitted he had expanded too quickly. Borrowed too aggressively. Ignored advisors who suggested slowing down. I thought caution was weakness. He smiled sadly. "It isn't. No, it takes confidence to grow. It takes wisdom to stop." When I left that afternoon, he thanked me for visiting. As I reached my car, he called out, "Ethan." I turned around. "I really am proud of what you've built." There was no audience. No relatives watching. No family dinner. Just 2 men standing in a quiet neighborhood. For the first time in my life, I believed him. About 8 months later, another major opportunity arrived. The company announced plans to create an entirely new operational division that would oversee strategic planning across North America. The position would report directly to the executive committee. Hundreds of applicants were expected. Internal, external, international. After 4 rounds of interviews, I was selected. At 42 years old, I became Executive Vice President of Strategy. The promotion wasn't just a title. It changed everything. Part of my new responsibility included approving senior leadership hires. Vice presidents, regional directors, executive advisors, people with decades of experience. Every final interview required at least 3 executives, sometimes 4. Every resume represented someone's career, someone's family, someone's future. It was a responsibility I never treated lightly. I remembered every interview I had ever attended, every nervous handshake, every uncertain smile, every hope carried into a conference room. I promised myself one thing: no candidate would ever leave feeling smaller than when they arrived, even if they weren't selected. Respect cost nothing. And yet, it was one of the rarest things people gave freely. 3 weeks into the new role, my assistant entered carrying a thin folder. "We've received an application from someone with extensive commercial real estate experience." She placed the resume on my desk. Interesting background. I opened the folder casually. Then I stopped breathing for just a moment. Richard Allen Carter. Age 65. Former founder and chief executive officer. I read every page carefully. There was no attempt to exaggerate. No inflated achievements. No excuses explaining the bankruptcy. Just fact. Years of leadership. Major projects. Community work. References. At the bottom of the final page, under the section labeled Reason for Seeking Employment, he had written only one sentence: "I'm looking for an opportunity to contribute, learn, and begin again." I read that sentence 3 times. Then I quietly closed the folder. Life had a remarkable sense of timing. And in less than 2 weeks, the man who had once laughed at my ordinary job would walk into an interview room where I would be one of the people deciding whether he received one. For several minutes, I simply sat there with the resume resting on my desk. Not because I didn't know what to do. Because I understood exactly what I had to do. The challenge wasn't making a decision. The challenge was making sure it was the right one. I called Human Resources. "Has the interview schedule been finalized?" "Almost," Karen replied. "We're planning next Thursday." "Who screened the applications?" "Our recruitment team." "And Uncle?" I stopped myself. "And Mr. Carter qualified through the normal process?" "Yes. He scored very well on experience." I thanked her and ended the call. That answer mattered. I never wanted anyone to believe family connections, good or bad, had influenced the process. If Richard was going to be interviewed, it would be because he had earned the opportunity. Nothing more. Nothing less. That evening I drove to my parents' house. Dad was trimming the hedge when I arrived. He switched off the electric trimmer and smiled. "I wasn't expecting you. I need your advice." He laughed. "That's usually dangerous." We sat on the back porch with 2 mugs of coffee. I handed him the resume. He adjusted his reading glasses. Halfway through the first page, he stopped. "So, exactly." He continued reading in silence. When he finished, he carefully placed the papers back on the table. So, what are you thinking?" I stared into my coffee. "I don't know." Dad nodded slowly. "I think you do. I just don't know how I feel. Those are different questions." He was right. Again. What if people think I favored him? Then don't. What if people think I punished him? Then don't. I smiled. You make it sound simple. It is simple. He leaned back in his chair. Simple doesn't always mean easy. The autumn wind moved gently through the trees. Dad looked toward the garden before speaking again. When you were 10 years old. Remember when your bicycle chain kept falling off? I laughed. Barely. You became so frustrated you wanted to throw the whole bicycle away. I remember that. You know what your grandfather said. I smiled. Fix the problem. Don't punish the bicycle. Dad nodded. Exactly. He looked directly at me. This interview isn't about the past. It's about whether your uncle can help your company today. Nothing else. That was the answer I needed. Not because it told me what decision to make. Because it reminded me how to make it. The following week was unusually busy. Board meetings. Budget reviews. Travel plans. Quarterly strategy sessions. Still, every time I looked at Thursday's calendar, my eyes paused on one line. 9:30 a.m. Executive candidate interview. Richard Carter. I wondered how he felt. Nervous. Embarrassed. Hopeful. Probably all three. I knew I would have been. Wednesday evening my phone rang. The caller ID displayed Grandma Helen. I smiled immediately. Hi, Grandma. Your father told me. He did. He worries. I laughed. He always has. She chuckled softly. Then her voice became gentle. Are you worried? A little. About seeing Richard. About making the right decision. She was quiet for several seconds. Ethan. Yes. Do you remember the quilt I made for your college graduation? I still have it. It took almost 2,000 stitches. I know. If one stitch had been crooked, would I have thrown away the entire quilt? No. Why not? Because the whole mattered more than one mistake. She let the silence settle. People are like quilts. We remember the torn places. But we should judge the whole life. I closed my eyes. Grandma had a remarkable ability to explain complicated ideas using ordinary things. I'll remember that. I know you will. Thursday arrived with clear skies and cool air. I reached the office just after 7. Earlier than usual. Partly because I wanted extra time. Partly because I couldn't stop thinking. The executive conference room overlooked the city skyline. The interview table had already been prepared. 3 bottles of water. Candidate folders. Evaluation sheets. Everything exactly where it belonged. At 8:45, the other interview panel members arrived. Laura, our Chief Operating Officer. Michael, Head of Human Resources. And me. We reviewed the agenda. The questions. The evaluation criteria. No one mentioned family. Only qualifications. Exactly as it should be. At 9:20 my assistant entered. The candidate has arrived. I nodded. Please ask him to wait 5 minutes. She smiled. Of course. The room became quiet after she left. Laura glanced at my resume folder. You've worked in commercial property before. Only indirectly. This candidate has impressive experience. He does. Michael agreed. His references speak highly of his leadership before the bankruptcy. I appreciated that observation. They had evaluated him independently. That made everything easier. At exactly 9:30 there was a soft knock on the door. Come in. The door opened. Richard stepped inside. Grey suit. Simple tie. Polished shoes that had clearly been worn for several years. He carried himself differently now. Less like someone entering a room to impress people. Maury like someone grateful to be invited. His eyes met mine. Recognition flashed across his face. Not surprise. He must have known after receiving the interview confirmation. Still, seeing me sitting behind the interview table made the reality unavoidable. For just a fraction of a second he hesitated. Then he straightened his shoulders. Good morning. His voice was steady. Professional. I stood first. Walked around the table. Extended my hand. Good morning, Richard. He looked at my hand. Then shook it firmly. His grip wasn't as confident as it had once been. But it was honest. Thank you for coming. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. The interview had officially begun. Not as revenge. Not as justice. Simply, as two professionals meeting across a table, ready to let the next chapter of both our lives be decided by character instead of history. The first 15 minutes felt surprisingly ordinary. Michael began with the standard introductions. Laura explained the responsibilities of the role. I outlined the long-term goals of the division and the type of leadership we were looking for. Richard listened carefully. He didn't interrupt. He took notes. That alone told me how much he had changed. Years earlier, he would have answered questions before anyone had finished asking them. Now he waited, thought, then spoke. Michael asked the first formal question. Mr. Carter, could you describe the largest team you've led? Richard answered without exaggeration. At our peak, approximately 340 employees across multiple project sites. What was the most difficult part of leading an organization that size? He smiled faintly. I used to think it was making decisions. He paused. I eventually learned it was listening. Laura wrote something on her evaluation sheet. I noticed. So did Richard. But he didn't try to impress her. He simply continued. The bigger a company becomes, the easier it is for leaders to hear only people who agree with them. I made that mistake. I won't make it again. There was no attempt to hide the past. No polished corporate language. Just accountability. The questions became more detailed. Risk management. Operational planning. Conflict resolution. Long-term forecasting. Richard answered each one carefully. Sometimes he admitted he didn't know. That honesty carried more weight than perfect answers ever could. At one point Laura asked, "Tell us about your greatest professional failure." The room became completely silent. Richard looked down at the table for several seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. I believed growth could solve every problem. It can't. I ignored people who advised patience because I confused caution with fear. I borrowed more than I should have. I expanded faster than I should have. And when conditions changed, I discovered that confidence isn't a substitute for preparation. No excuses. No blaming the economy. No blaming competitors. No blaming employees. Just responsibility. Michael stopped writing for a moment. So what did that experience teach you? Richard smiled sadly. That humility is much cheaper to learn before failure than after it. No one spoke. Not because the answer was dramatic. Because it was true. Halfway through the interview, Laura excused herself briefly to take an urgent call. Michael stepped out to speak with human resources. For the first time, Richard and I were alone. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, he looked at me. I almost withdrew my application. Why? I thought it might make things uncomfortable. It doesn't. He nodded slowly. I wasn't sure. I know. He folded his hands together. I've replayed so many family dinners in my mind these past 2 years. I remained quiet. I remember every joke. Every comment. I honestly believed I was motivating you. He shook his head. I wasn't. I was protecting my own ego. I looked at him. I figured that out eventually. I'm sorry. I know. He looked relieved when I said those two words. Not forgiven completely. Just heard. After another moment he smiled slightly. You know something funny? What? I finally bought an ordinary used sedan. I laughed. How do you like it? It starts every morning. We both laughed. Then he added quietly. You were right. The door opened. Laura and Michael returned. The interview continued. The final question belonged to me. I had thought carefully about it the night before. Not because I wanted to test him. Because I wanted to understand him. I closed my folder. Mr. Carter. Yes. Imagine you're hired. 6 months from now, a younger employee joins the company. They drive an old car. They have an ordinary apartment. They're quiet. They remind you of someone you once knew. The room remained still. What advice would you give them? Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he smiled. A real smile. The kind that reached his eyes. I wouldn't give them advice. The three of us waited. I'd ask them what they're building. He continued softly. Because I spent too many years judging people's present, without understanding their future. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Perspective. He had finally understood the lesson life had been trying to teach him all along. The interview ended a few minutes later. Richard stood. Shook everyone's hand. When he reached me, he hesitated. No matter what you decide. Thank you for treating me fairly. I nodded. Safe drive home. I will. He walked out quietly. The door closed behind him. No dramatic music. No emotional confrontation. Just silence. Laura was the first to speak. Strong candidate. Michael agreed immediately. Very. Then Laura looked at me. I know he's your uncle. I also know you haven't said a single thing that influenced this discussion. She smiled. I appreciate that. I nodded. Thank you. The three of us began reviewing every evaluation sheet. Experience. Leadership. Communication. Judgment. Adaptability. Integrity. Each category received independent scores before anyone discussed them. When the numbers were totaled, Richard ranked first. Not because he was family. Not because of sympathy. Because he had earned it. And as I looked at the final evaluation sheet, I realized the greatest form of justice isn't watching someone fall. It's being able to look them in the eye after everything that happened. And still choosing fairness. The decision still wasn't official. Company policy required one final review by the executive committee before any senior leadership offer could be extended. Normally, it was a formality. Even so, procedures existed for a reason. Rules protected everyone, including me. I submitted the interview evaluations exactly as they had been completed. No additional comments. No personal recommendations. Just the documented results. Later that afternoon, our Chief Executive Officer, Daniel Brooks, called me into his office. He closed the door behind me. I've reviewed the interview notes. I nodded. So have I. He looked at me for a moment. You handled today professionally. Thank you. I imagine it wasn't easy. It wasn't. He leaned back in his chair. You know why we insist on interview panels instead of individual decisions? To remove personal bias. Exactly. He smiled. And today that system worked exactly as designed. That sentence stayed with me. The system had done what people sometimes struggled to do on their own. It looked at evidence, not history, qualifications, not emotions. The executive committee approved the recommendation the following morning. Human Resources prepared the offer. Before it was sent, Michael stopped by my office. I thought you'd want to know first. I looked up from my laptop. He accepted. He hasn't received it yet. Michael smiled. But I think he will. He walked toward the door before turning back. Do you know, I've interviewed executives for almost 20